and welcome to the Ghosts and Folklore podcast. I'm Mark Rees, and on each episode, I investigate a different, weird, and wonderful subject. And on this episode, we are going in search of a terrifying poltergeist that caused havoc in rural Wales. And while the haunting started, conventionally enough, throwing stones and making noises, it escalated to the point where the family were forced to flee their home for their own safety. And what I particularly like about this account is that we have a diary record of the haunting. We have an account that reveals how the activity gradually escalated day by day until it reached boiling point. And so, to begin at the beginning. And I've spoken about poltergeists many a time on this podcast over the years. If you missed those episodes, feel free to go back rummaging through the archives afterwards. But just in case you're unsure about what exactly a poltergeist is, I thought we'd kick things off with a quick definition from the Oxford Guide to Such Things, which tells us that, to quote, a poltergeist is a ghost or other supernatural being supposedly responsible for physical disturbances, such as making loud noises and throwing objects about. The term comes in the mid-19th century from the German words Poltern and Geist. Poltern, which means create a disturbance, and Geist, which means ghost. So, a poltergeist, very briefly, is a noisy, potentially nasty spirit, and the term poltergeist was popularised in the 19th century from two German words, Poltern and Geist, to give us the word we use today. And if you're wondering what words rhyme with poltergeist, and I don't know why you would be wondering that, but if you were wondering what words rhyme with poltergeist, well, it just so happens that when I was searching for that definition in the Oxford Guide to Such Things, I accidentally searched in the Oxford Rhyming Dictionary first, and it seems like a shame to waste good research. So I thought I'd share this with you very quickly, just in case you ever decide to write some poetic verses or compose some song lyrics about poltergeists. This could come in very handy. So here we go. The word poltergeist rhymes with Christ, heist, underpriced, unsliced, or the combination words zeitgeist and antichrist. And you never know when those rhymes might come in handy. But anyway, I digress. That's enough of a tangent. Back to this description. And with the word poltergeist being popularised in the mid-19th century, that means any poltergeist activity before then and after then, until the word was properly established, which wasn't until well into the 20th century. People weren't saying poltergeist, they were blaming this activity on other things. Depending on how far back you go, this might be the fairy folk who are often keen on throwing things around and causing a noise, witchcraft maybe, or the devil himself. And in the case of the accounts on this episode, the activity is blamed on spirits that throw stones. Not poltergeists specifically, even though we would now call them poltergeists, but spirits that throw stones. And as you will soon discover, these spirits did a heck of a lot more than just throw stones, and they fit in very neatly with that description from the Oxford Dictionary. Now, these accounts were published in the early 1900s, but do date from times before then. And one quick example concerns an old man called John Jones, who lived in Pontryd Vendigaid, and he spoke of a ghost which haunted a farm between there and Tregaron that was, to quote, engaged in the dangerous game of stone throwing to the great discomfort of the family. So this farm between himself and Tregaron was the home of a family discomforted by this activity, which is one way of putting it. I bet they were discomforted by having these stones thrown at them. And the folklorist does say, I don't know if this reassures them or not, but the folklorist does point out that this was far from uncommon. There were similar accounts across Wales and, of course, across the world world, and these accounts continue to this day. Fast forward 100 years, and poltergeist activity, or whatever they called it at the time, has been reported anywhere and everywhere for centuries. Whatever part of the world you're in, whatever country, whatever culture, whatever time period even, people have encountered this dangerous invisible force. And what really sets the poltergeist apart from other ghosts or other spirits is that whereas people like to reassure you and say, don't worry, they can't hurt you, it's just the wind, it's nothing to be afraid of, in this case that would be a lie. These things, these poltergeists, whatever they might be, there are many, many different theories out there to try and explain this activity. Whatever label you want to put on them, whether these are spirits of the dead returning to torment us, whether it's some kind of psychic, mental activity, whether it's something else entirely, there is something that can hurt you and there is something to be afraid of. Which is a nice, cheerful way of leading you into this episode's main account. Now, this strange tale, as it is described, was found in an old Welsh language book called Golwg ar y Byd, which means a view of the world, by the folklorist J.C. Davis, who also handily translated it into English, which saves me a big chunk of work. Thank you, Mr. Davis. And this account was originally written by the Reverend D. Lewis, vicar of Llangatug in Glamorganshire, as it was then, in 1725. So, we're going back a few centuries for this one, and this account was written by a man of the cloth, which, as regular listeners will know, is considered to be a reliable witness. This isn't some drunkard, this isn't some local madman, this is a man of the church. He can be trusted, and it concerns the parish of Llangella in Carmarthenshire, where, on May the 21st, 1917, and I do love how specific this account is. We've got dates, we've got diaries, we've got the lot. On May the 21st, 1719, a spirit, which continued for some time, began to throw stones at those who were in the field. So a spirit, which continued for some time, began to throw stones at those who were in the field. So the whole affair kicks off with what is quite standard poltergeist behaviour, throwing stones, and it does happen here specifically outdoors. It was in the field where people are working. Now, what follows, I am going to read directly from the good Reverend's accounts, partly because I just love the way it's been done, diary style. This is documentary evidence of a kind. And even though it was written centuries ago, it shares so many similarities with modern-day accounts. In fact, you could say it's spooky how similar they are, but of course I wouldn't make such a cheap pun. And he tells us that, to quote, "On Thursday, in Whitsun week, at 8 in the morning, the thrashing began at a farm." And by thrashing, I'm assuming they mean threshing in this context. I'm no expert on agricultural matters, but threshing the grain which they did after the harvest is, to the best of my knowledge, what was going on here. The thrashing began, and at the same time he, the spirit, began to throw stones. So they're at work, the stones start coming at them, and it's interesting here that straight away the Reverend assumes that 1, this is a spirit, and 2, it is a male spirit, or is just using the lazy shorthand, but either way, the spirit, or whatever is causing this, is referred to as a he. And to return to the account, and at first it was one of the men who were thrashing that noticed a stone descending on the thrashing floor. So the floor they were working on, they saw this stone fall. And the second stone fell on the leg of the housemaid, wounding her. So we're getting serious quite quickly here. We've already got someone injured by one of these stones. And after this, we are told, very shortly, those stones filled the thrashing floor. The men who were thrashing gave up their work and went to see who were throwing them, but could see no one. So, we are only on day 1 here. We're on the Thursday and things are straight away getting quite heated. These stones are being thrown down increasingly at the men in the field, so much so that they hurt the housemaid, wounding her, we are told, by hitting her on the leg. So quite an eventful Thursday of Whitsun week. Now, moving on to Friday, and the servant maid in the garden was struck 3 times. So again, a house worker outside is struck by stones, 3 times by stones. And if that wasn't enough, several of the children were struck until they went out of the house. So this is an interesting development on the second day because the children are being hit by stones inside, so this isn't just isolated to those working the fields outside. And to continue, a large number of people came together to see these wonders, and all who came were allowed to see the stones descending. Now, a large number of people is slightly vague, but we can assume a sizable amount of people did see these wonders. They saw these stones seemingly flying through the air with their own eyes, and as such, word soon spread. More and more people start gathering outside the home, which, frankly, I imagine is the last thing the people living there and working there wanted at such a busy time of year. But curious people descended on the house, much like the stones, to witness this activity, and all who came, we are told, were allowed to see the stones descending. So, an eventful Thursday, an eventful Friday. What happened on Saturday? Would this escalation continue? Well, you're about to find out, because on Saturday, the servant maid and one of the threshers was struck. So to answer that question quite quickly, yes, the activity does indeed continue. And some of the stones, we are told, were rattling. And something like marks on several of them. So they noticed that there were marks on the stones that were being thrown. Now, the stones were not seen till they fell. And when they were taken up, marks of them were on the floor, as if they had been there from the year before. And my understanding of that is that when people picked up these stones off the floor, they left marks behind as if they'd been there for a long time. You know, when you pick up a stone that's been in the ground for a year, you can see the shape it leaves behind. And these stones were seemingly doing that despite freshly falling from the sky. And it was more than just stones, because a large pole came right across the window without anyone visibly bringing it. So now we have a pole seemingly as well as stones moving by itself. And despite this, we are told there are still some doubters out there. We are told that some people believed not, till they sent messengers to see and to bring home some of the stones to their houses, which is a nice little detail. There are people who can't make it there in person, and they doubt the stories they've been told until their messengers returned home and said, yes, I've seen it with my own eyes, and here is one of the stones, one of those marked stones that was thrown in my presence. And if that wasn't quite enough for one day, we haven't finished with Saturday yet, because on Saturday, a large stump of wood was taken up from the boiler to the housetop and fell in another place. So the main takeaway from Saturday is that not only is the activity continuing and escalating, but the objects are changing as well. We've got a big lump of wood, we've got poles flying past windows, and the stones are seemingly marked in 2 ways. They are marked for identification, and they're also leaving marks in the ground where they fell. And the whole situation at this point, all of the descriptions remind me a bit of the spooky tourism industry, which of course is big business nowadays, but even centuries ago, people were going out on their own kind of paranormal investigations, and they are taking a little memento home with them. Here is my stone from the ghost house. I guess the big difference nowadays is they would charge you £50 for that stone, whereas back then, I am assuming these stones were free, although there was an element of danger associated to them. They might knock you unconscious, but if not, you're free to keep the stones. Now, moving on to Sunday, the Lord's Day, and I am sure the Reverend would have been a very busy man on Sundays, but nevertheless, he still has time to record what is happening in and around the house. And he tells us that a large number of people, again, came together to see what was going on at the house, and several of them were cursing and swearing and speaking lightly and blasphemously, which is just shocking behaviour for the God-fearing people of Wales in the 18th century. I'm sure this doesn't reflect on all of the good people of Carmarthenshire, but clearly there were a handful of people who weren't afraid to blaspheme on a Sunday, and this may or may not explain what happens next, because it's all about to kick off. And the Reverend tells us that big stones fell on the loft of the house, although unusually they were not seen until they had descended. So these big stones were raining down, but they weren't seen raining, as it were. They weren't seen falling. I'm assuming they must have just heard a bang and then saw them land on the ground. And it wasn't just big stones that were being used, but iron bars. Yes, we've moved on to iron bars. Never mind being worried about being hit by a stone. It's the iron bars you've really got to look out for. One iron bar smashed through a window, and another one was bent as a pack saddle's hook. And if you aren't familiar with a pack saddle's hook, which I imagine is most people who aren't cowboys or whoever else would have use for them, but it really, really is curved. If you can imagine those old cartoons in which strongmen or wrestlers bend iron bars, and they bend them all the way round so they curve into a circle and wrap in on themselves. If you can imagine that, but the wrestler is invisible and the bar is just bending into a circle, that's kind of the thing that's going on here, and that's probably one of the most unhelpful descriptions I've given on this podcast to try and explain something. If anyone can make sense of that, it's like an invisible wrestler bending bars in an old cartoon. That is what was going on in Carmarthenshire in the 18th century. But the window was certainly struck by these iron bars, which were, we are told, broken all to pieces. And that was just in the daytime. It hasn't gotten dark yet. And we are told that at night, the stones came into the beds and window frames went to the loft, so that the family of the house were obliged to get up from their beds and go to a neighbour's house. Nothing but stones could be seen, filling the house and surrounding it. And at this point, if we accept all of this is accurate, which of course it must be, it's written by a reverend, but if we accept that this is indeed accurate, then it goes way beyond the typical poltergeist activity for this period. Not that they would call it poltergeist activity, but it goes way beyond the usual throwing a couple of stones about the place. We've got a house that is being filled with stones. The surrounding area is being bombarded too. It's striking people in their beds and it's opening windows. And as I've spoken about on previous episodes, things like stone throwing could be the work of practical jokers. It could be people messing around. It could be more malicious. It could be a disgruntled worker trying to cause trouble, trying to get their own back, trying to scare people away. These more human and less paranormal explanations might very well be the case in a lot of those other examples, and I am sure there are people at the time who assumed this activity had a human source, like those people who sent their messengers to go and check it out for them. But when this is happening every single day, again and again, on such a scale, inside and out, day and night, eventually somebody would be spotted. There would be a giveaway. But in this case, with big stones being thrown day or night, inside and out, metal bars being bent, flying past windows, flying through windows, with huge gangs of witnesses, either there is some incredibly elaborate hoax going on, or could this really be paranormal in nature? Well, we do have one more day left in the diary, which might shed further light on things. And there is a gap of a couple of days, presumably because the family had run away. There wasn't anyone at the house. But we pick things up again on the Wednesday night. So 3 days after they fled, or 3 nights after they fled, this is specifically on Wednesday night that the Reverend writes that Wednesday night, the barn and the corn, as well as many other things, were burnt. which is one heck of a way to kick off a diary entry. The barn and the corn, as well as many other things, were burnt. And as for the spirit, he, we are told, is still throwing things every day. But the good news is, if you can see this as good news, not throwing things every hour. So while this starts quite shockingly, obviously burning stuff is the worst thing so far, it also seems to mark something of an ending, because afterwards the stone throwing does gradually decline. And he continues, sometimes the stones were thrown as fast as one could reckon them, most of which were river stones, and some of them weighing about 7 pounds or more. So now they've worked out where these stones are coming from, at least. They're coming from the river, and they are flying through the air so fast, like Wally West whizzing by, weighing 7 pounds or more. Now, of course, the number of stones that seems to have been thrown in and around this house would suggest that there'd be none left in the river by this point, so maybe there's other sources too, but they certainly identified some as coming from the river. And so it was that on this Wednesday night, to try and finally put an end to all of this, we are told that the neighbours came together to pray to God in the house. And there was not much noise in the house that night. Many other things were done by the spirit, but he at last ceased. So, in this case, it would appear, we do have something of a happy ending. And it also shows that the good Christian people of Carmarthenshire did come through in the end. Not those sweary ones from earlier just making things worse, but the nice ones who prayed long and hard in the house. And while the spirit did not go gently into that good night, as it were, it did eventually de-escalate, and it did put an end to the haunting. But did it do so permanently? Well, the short answer to that is, I don't know. Because I don't know where this place is specifically. That is often done on purpose to protect the identity of those involved, which is great for them, but very frustrating for would-be ghost hunters who want to go and visit these places afterwards. What I do know, however, is that this isn't the only report of its kind in the area. In fact, our folklorist tells us that at the time of translating this, so in the early 20th century, hundreds of years after the events and 100 years before I sat down to record this episode, he tells us that a troublesome ghost of this kind had recently been bothering another unfortunate victim in Carmarthenshire in the Vale of Towie. So while centuries might have passed, similar activity is still taking place in and around this area. And who knows? Maybe it's the same spirit who, having been forced out with all of that praying, simply relocated, simply found a new victim. Or maybe there is more than one. Maybe there are multiples of this kind of what we would describe as poltergeist haunting the wilds of Carmarthenshire, the wilds of Wales, and the wilds of the world. And on that rather ominous note, we've reached the end of another episode of the Ghosts and Folklore podcast. Thank you for listening. And if you enjoyed this episode and you haven't already, please consider pressing the subscribe button, especially because the next episode is going to be the Halloween special, and I've always got some spooky surprises up my sleeve for my Halloween specials. I might even treat you to an amazing special effect or two. It has been a while. And if you can't wait until then, of course, you can go back and check out all the old Halloween specials. There's plenty to catch up on. There's a few ghost hunts and other crazy things I've done over the years. If you really enjoyed this episode, you can support the podcast by rating it and reviewing it and telling your friends all about it. It only takes seconds, but it really does help because it's quite easy for a podcast like this one to get lost amongst all the huge corporate podcasts. So all those reviews, all those ratings really do help shine a little bit of light on these more DIY productions, shall we say. Finally, if you really enjoyed the podcast and you want to support support it going forward, you can treat me to a coffee via my website, which is always very much appreciated, and which this time of year will definitely be a pumpkin spiced coffee. If you'd like more Ghosts and Folklore, you can follow me on social media, and as well as this podcast, I've written a number of books about similar, weird, and wonderful subjects which are available from all good bookshops, offline and on. My most recent book, as regular listeners will know because I didn't shut up about it for episodes on end, is Paranormal Swansea and Gower, and I do have some more events lined up in Swansea and hopefully Gower over the Halloween period or in October. I don't want to give specific dates right now because I need to get those confirmed, but if you do follow me on social media, you will hear all about them, or if you'd like to get in touch via the website, send me an email or something, we can do our best to let you know when those dates are. So they are coming up in Swansea. I've also got one coming up in Porthcawl, which will be great in October, in the Rusty Cauldron, a wonderful witchy shop. You should go there, never mind me, go there anyway, it's a great place. And I'm hoping to get some more dates further afield. I have been invited over the border for some dates, and I very, very nearly made it to New England this autumn. I've been saying that for years. It nearly happened this year, but sadly, life got in the way. But maybe next year it really will happen. But I'm hoping to get some more dates, but as you might have noticed, I am very much focused on Swansea and Gower this Halloween season, simply because that is where my most recent book is set. But of course, I don't want to neglect the rest of the world, so fingers crossed, I'll be popping up near you when you least expect it. And after all of that shameless, absolutely shameless self-promotion, it just leaves me to say thank you very much for listening. Diolch and var iawn am wrando. I've been Mark Rees. This has been my Ghosts and Folklore podcast, beaming to you from Wales to the world. And remember, if you do find yourself disturbed by a poltergeist who eats all your bread and leaves it unsliced, and tries to sell you stones hideously overpriced, just be glad it's not the Antichrist. Until next time, Nosta.